Dear fellow readers, I invite you to embark on a sea journey with me. Board the ship as we will travel to the stormy sea, across the ocean, all the way to the south, to the Antarctic, where we will be stuck in ice and be freed when an albatross comes across the sky, which will be shot, which will bring bad luck to the whole crew. We will meet death, and we will meet life in death, and we will travel for a long time. So stay tuned as I discuss the poem The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Colerdidge in this video, one of the greatest poems written in the English Romanticism. So before we get started into the video and talking about The Rime of the Ancient Mariner in more detail, I quickly want to welcome you to this video and to my channel. In case you're new here, my name is Laura and I'm a PhD student of Comparative Literature in Germany. And on this channel I create videos on Gothic and Romantic literature, on fantasy and science fiction literature from ancient times to the present, and on literary theory, especially on hermeneutics. So if that's something you're interested in, I will link my playlist that contain all of my videos down below in the description of this video. And in this video on The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, I will first give you a short summary of the 7 parts of the poem. Then I will talk about the figures of death and life in death in the poem that are quite striking and interesting. Then I will talk about the key themes and motifs in the poem. I will talk about the inspiration for the poem that Coleridge got when he was on a walk with his friend, the poet William Wordsworth. Then I will also talk about the reception of the poem, so how was it received by the public, by the audience in the late 18th century and then also throughout the 19th and 20th century, and what is the role of the poem today. And in the very end I will talk about some references that were made to the poem in popular culture. And just a short disclaimer, of course I'm not at the ocean, the stormy ocean that I've been mentioning at the start of the video. But I found it quite suiting to film parts of the video by the sea when I was traveling in Greece. So I hope you enjoy the scenes and enjoy the video. We want to start with a summary of the poem. It is containing 7 parts, each of which are quite long. In part 1, the poem begins with the ancient mariner stopping a wedding guest to tell him his story. The mariner recounts his voyage that initially goes well, with the ship and its crew members sailing smoothly across the ocean. However, the ship enters uncharted territories in the Antarctic and the sailors become trapped by ice. Suddenly an albatross appears and its arrival seems to bring good fortune as the ice breaks and the ship sails on. In part 2, in a sudden and thoughtless act, the mariner shoots the albatross with his crossbow. At first, the sailors are furious with him, blaming him for killing the bird that helped them. However, they soon rationalize that perhaps killing the bird was a good decision, as the fog lifts and the ice breaks. Still, strange events follow, and the ship becomes becalmed in a deadly calm sea. In part 3, the ship is stuck again, and the sailors suffer from extreme thirst. This is when they start to blame the mariner for killing the albatross. The mariner bears the weight of the crew's anger as they hang the dead albatross around his neck to symbolize his guilt. Then a ghostly ship appears with 2 supernatural figures aboard, death and life in death. They start to gamble for the sailors' souls. Life and death wins the soul of the mariner, condemning him to a fate worse than death, while death claims the rest of the crew, who immediately die. In part 4, the mariner, alone among the dead crew, suffers immense psychological torment. He wishes for death, but is denied. But later he begins to appreciate the beauty of the natural world, blessing the sea creatures he once had despised. At this moment, the albatross falls from his neck, symbolizing the beginning of his redemption. In part 5, the mariner falls into deep sleep and awakens to rain, which could symbolize a cleansing renewal. The ship is mysteriously propelled forward by supernatural forces. The bodies of the dead sailors are reanimated by spirits and help steer the ship homewards. Yet, the mariner hears voices discussing his continued penance, indicating his redemption is not yet complete. In part 6, the ship sails back towards the mariner's homeland, aided by the spirits and the reanimated crew. The mariner sees angels surrounding the bodies of the dead sailors, suggesting their peaceful release. However, the mariner remains under divine scrutiny and continues to carry the weight of his sin. In part 7, which is the final part, the ship finally arrives back at shore. A hermit, symbolizing spiritual absolution, helps the mariner confess his sins. The mariner is forgiven, but his punishment is to wander the earth, compelled to tell his story as a warning to others. In the very final scene, the wedding guest, now deeply affected, leaves the mariner as a sadder and wiser man. The figures of death and life and death in the poem appear in part 3, when they arrive to the crew on a ghostly ship. These two supernatural beings are personifications of different forms of suffering and fate, representing opposing but complementary forces that dictate the mariner's punishment and the fate of his crew. And I quickly want to talk a little bit more about both death and life and death and their symbolic meaning in the poem. So death is personified as a male figure in the poem, embodying the traditional concept of physical demise. He is associated with the immediate end of life and, by extension, the end of suffering through the release of the soul from the body. When death wins the soul of the mariner's crewmates, they all die instantly, falling one by one, leaving the mariner alone. Death's role is relatively straightforward in the poem. He claims the lives of the crew, symbolizing the consequences of sin, the killing of the albatross, and the inevitability of death as a natural force. For the sailors, death is an escape from the horrors they have experienced. They are spared further suffering by the dying, which contrasts sharply with the mariner's fate. Life and death is a far more complex and terrifying figure in the poem. Described as a female with red lips and freezing cold skin, her name suggests a paradox. She represents a state of living death, where one remains alive but endures immense psychological and existential suffering. When life and death wins the mariner's soul in the game of dice, he is condemned to a fate worse than physical death. Instead of dying with his crewmates, he is doomed to live on, burdened by guilt and isolation. Life and death symbolizes a form of spiritual or psychological torment that surpasses the physical release of death. The mariner becomes trapped in this liminal state, forced to endure the consequences of his actions without the relief of death. His suffering is prolonged as he is haunted by the memory of his dead shipmates and the knowledge that he is responsible for their demise. The figure embodies the horror of existence without hope or peace, an existence where guilt and regret are unending. So in conclusion, in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, death represents a release from earthly suffering, while life and death signifies an ongoing state of torment that traps the mariner in a living hell. The two figures symbolize different forms of punishment for death. One that ends in physical death, and the other, far more terrifying, that condemns a soul to wander the earth. Alive but spiritually dead, forced to live with the consequences of its guilt. The contrast between the fates of the sailor and the mariner underscores the poem's exploration of existential suffering, guilt, and the consequences of human actions against nature and the divine. Next up, we will talk about the key themes and motifs of the poem. The first I would call sin and guilt, because the killing of the albatross represents a fundamental sin against nature, and the mariner's reckless act initiates a cycle of punishment and suffering for him, which is symbolized by the weight of the dead albatross around his neck. And of this became even a saying in the English language, to have an albatross around one's neck. You can look it up. I think it's quite interesting to see how influential this poem was in the English language and also in everyday life, obviously. The second theme is redemption and penance, because the poem explores the mariner's gradual recognition of the sanctity of all living things. His eventual act of blessing the sea creatures is a moment of spiritual awakening that begins his path towards redemption, though his penance continues as he is condemned to retell his story over and over and walk the earth telling the story. So redemption and penance really are connected quite strongly in the poem. The third motif I would call nature and the supernatural, because the poem intertwines natural and supernatural elements, using devices such as the albatross, the ghost ship, and the figures of death and life and death to illustrate the power of nature and the spiritual consequences of violating its order. And the fourth and final theme is isolation and alienation, because the mariner's solitude following the death of his crew symbolizes the isolation that comes from guilt and sin. His alienation is both physical and psychological, emphasizing the deep personal cost of his actions. So just to sum it up, the themes I would call sin and guilt, redemption and penance, nature and the supernatural, and isolation and alienation. These are the most important ones and ones you often find in Romantic and Gothic literature. The idea for the poem The Rime of the Ancient Mariner was born on a walk that Samuel Taylor Colerdidge took together with William Wordsworth and his younger sister Dorothy when they were walking the Quantock Hills in Somerset. And they discussed a book that Wordsworth was reading that described a privateering voyage in 1719, during which a melancholy sailor, Simon Hadley, shot a black albatross. And in his work Biographia Literaria, Coleridge reflects on the writing of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner in the following way. The thought for writing the Ancient Mariner suggested itself to which of us I do not recollect that a series of poems might be composed of two sorts. In the one, incidents and agents were to be, in part at least, supernatural, and the excellence aimed at was to consist in the interesting of the affections by the dramatic truth of such emotions as would naturally accompany such situations, supposing them real. And real in this sense they have been to every human being who, from whatever source of delusion, has at any time believed himself under supernatural agency. For the second class, subjects were to be chosen from ordinary life. In this idea originated the plan of the lyrical ballads, in which it was agreed that my endeavour should be directed to persons and characters supernatural, or at least romantic, yet so as to transform from our inward nature a human interest and a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitutes poetic faith. With this view I wrote The Ancient Mariner. So how was the poem received by the public? At first, when it was published in 1798 to 1800, people reacted with confusion and criticism. They were puzzled by the poem's unusual supernatural themes, archaic language and complex moral undertones. The supernatural elements, such as the ghost ship, the figures of death and life in death, and the reanimation of dead sailors, were seen by some as bizarre and overly fanciful. Coleridge's use of archaic diction, such as eftsoons and quoth, also baffled readers, and it felt out of place in contemporary poetic language. The public, more accustomed to straightforward storytelling and clear moral lessons in poetry, found the Rime of the Ancient Mariner difficult to interpret. Its allegorical and symbolic nature, as well as its long, meandering structure, confused readers who were unsure how to connect with the strange and ominous narrative. Critics and readers alike struggled with the poem's moral ambiguity. The killing of the albatross, and the mariner's subsequent punishment seemed too arbitrary and severe for some, while the spiritual world and moral lessons at the end of the poem were not as explicit or neatly packaged as expected in the traditional moral tales. As Romanticism gained momentum around 1800, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner began to be appreciated for its exploration of imagination, the supernatural, and its reflection of the romantic ideals of reverence for nature and the exploration of the individual psyche. Coleridge's use of Gothic elements, the depiction of the mariner's psychological torment, and the philosophical depth of the poem became more widely understood and admired. So, as you can see, there's a shift happening in the perception. Romantic poets and critics such as Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley recognized the poem's unique brilliance. It resonated with their own interests in the supernatural, the sublime, and nature, and the exploration of intense emotion and guilt. Shelley in particular praised Coleridge for the poem's vivid and striking imagination. Coleridge reflected himself as well on the initial confusion surrounding the poem and added glosses or marginal notes in later editions to the poem, starting in 1817 until the final publication that was published in 1834. He did that to clarify some of its more allegorical and moral aspects. And therefore these notes helped future readers to better interpret and understand the poem's layers of meaning and moral lessons. By the mid-19th century, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner was recognized as one of the foundational works of English Romantic poetry. It was praised for its innovative use of supernatural elements, its deep psychological insight, and its exploration of the relationship between humanity and nature. And literary critics began to explore the poem's complexity in greater detail, focusing on themes such as sin, redemption, and the moral and spiritual messages encoded within the tale. In the Victorian period, poets such as Thomas de Quincey hailed the poem as a work of profound emotional and philosophical depth. Its emphasis on spiritual redemption, which resonated with the Victorian concern for morality and faith, brought the poem closer to mainstream appreciation. In the 20th century, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner continued to be a subject of scholarly attention and analysis. The poem became a touchstone for exploring Coleridge's philosophy, his views on imagination, and his religious and metaphysical concern. So, although the Ancient Mariner was first met with confusion and even criticism when it was published in 1798, it gradually became one of the most respected and analyzed works of English Romantic literature. Its exploration of guilt, redemption, and humanity's connection to nature, along with its innovative use of supernatural and Gothic elements, made it a foundational text in both Romanticism and also the broader literary canon of England from the 19th century. And today it is celebrated for its rich layers of meaning, its psychological depth, and its artistic ambition. So, after we've been discussing several aspects of the poem itself, its inspiration and reception, before I start, I just want to give a little disclaimer. There's hundreds of references and there's a whole Wikipedia page just summarizing these references, and probably there's even a lot more. So I will just mention a few that stood out to me, but I just invite you to see if you find some references yourself or just look into the Wikipedia page, which really summarizes that very well. And I would just go through some examples of literature and music and art. So to start with art, the French painter Gustave Doré has been painting scenes from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner very beautifully. Really worth taking time to look at the details in these paintings because they are just absolutely masterfully beautiful. So please just take some time. Then I just want to mention some examples from music. There's two things that stood out to me. The first one is that the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is a song by the English heavy metal band Iron Maiden, you probably know. It's from their 5th studio album Power Slave from 1984. And the song is based on Coleridge's poem with many direct quotes from the text, which is quite interesting. And the song is also almost 14 minutes long. And like the poem, it contains several distinct sections with different moods. It has remained a fan favorite, and it's definitely worth listening to. Whether you like Iron Maiden or not, just look up the song because it's definitely interesting, especially after you've been reading the poem. The other musical reference is in Fleetwood Mac's hit song Albatross, which drew its title quite obviously from the poem, as the composer Peter Green read the poem when he was in school. There's other references as well, of course. And now I want to mention an example from literature. So in Anne Rice's novel Interview with the Vampire, Louis de Pointe-du-Lac quoted these lines when referring to Claudia. Her lips were red, her looks were free, her locks were yellow as gold, her skin was as white as a leprosy, the nightmare alive in death was she, who thicks man's blood with cold. And this is just like an example, such as in Iron Maiden's song, where they quote directly from the poem. Then you also have a feature in Douglas Adams' novel Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. I haven't read the novel myself, I only saw the series, which I can definitely recommend. But there is this illusion when the title character time travels to interrupt Coleridge's work on his poem Kubla Khan during a rambling dialogue intended to prevent Coleridge from unintentionally encoding in the poem information that could lead to the destruction of the human race. Dirk Gently's reference to Albert Ross, another character in the novel, are misheard as Albatross, which Coleridge says might be an idea for another poem he is working on, and superior to a previous idea involving a meteor striking the earth. So that's going a little bit further, but it's also quite interesting, and also this idea of Albert Ross and Albatross. So I really like that. And the last literary reference I want to mention was my favorite one, because it was actually mentioned by Mary Shelley in Frankenstein, which was published in 1817, so not even so much later than the publication of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, in the time when it was just becoming popular and read more widely. And in chapter 5 of Frankenstein, she gives a quote in the words of Victor Frankenstein. She quotes the lines, "Like one that on lonesome road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread." That is quoted from the edition of 1817. And also in the book's opening letters from Robert Walton to his sister, specifically in letter 2, Walton explicitly mentions the poem by name and claims he shall kill no albatross on his journey. So obviously Mary Shelley has read the poem and was influenced by that as well. So there's a lot more other references, but just to give you an impression that in popular culture it was referenced a lot and quite popular as well. So, in conclusion, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner stands as a cornerstone of both Gothic and Romantic literary traditions, in my opinion, because through its vivid imagery, supernatural elements, and explorations of themes such as guilt, isolation, and redemption, Coleridge masterfully blends the eerie atmosphere of the Gothic with the emotional depth and reverence for nature that you see in Romanticism. The poem's haunting narrative captures the tension between humanity and the natural world, while also delving into the psychological complexities of the human soul as you see what the mariner is going through. As one of the most iconic works of its time, it continues to influence modern interpretations of the Gothic and Romantic movements and reminds us of the profound power of storytelling to probe the mysteries of existence. And this is just what I want to sum the video up with. If you stayed till the end, thank you very much for watching, and please consider subscribing to the channel because this would help me a lot and also make me see that you enjoy the video. I would definitely recommend reading the poem yourself and really taking your time. Maybe you also look into an audio version of the poem, that can also be very good. And other than that, I would like to see you in my next video, and thank you very much for watching and staying till the end. See you, bye bye!